Okay, marhaban marathania, welcome back. Well, I hope you had success with Aleph and you're feeling confident with your first letter. Now we're going to add our second letter to this. And in the first part, I said we have two types of letters, consonants and vowels, and we have two types of shapes, connecting and non-connecting. Well, we did a non-connecting vowel, Aleph, first. Now we're going to do a consonant that connects. So at the end of this lesson, you will learn basically all the different types of letters that are out there. So you really have a lot of the mechanics of the alphabet down. Okay, this letter is called Nuun, and that's the name of the letter. You don't pronounce it that way, like we say W for the sound wa. Nuun, now you might guess from the N, Nuun. Nuun has the sound of N, as in N in English, as in nice, November, night, nearly. Okay? It's a very similar sound to what we have, and so it should be easy to recognize when you hear it. Now, as I said, Nuun is a connecting letter, so it's going to connect to what comes after it. So because of that, and this is true of really all of our connecting letters, they're going to look slightly different if they appear at the beginning of a word, if they have something before and after them, and if they appear at the end of a word or by themselves, depending on what connects to it. So you're going to see some slight differences. Notice my lines, and this may look like going back to first grade for you. All right, this is a typical line, and this line about 1/3 up is very important because some of our letters are only going to go up this high. So let's look at how to make this Nuun, the N sound, at the beginning of a word. Well, I'm only going to go up here to about the 1/3 part. And I'm going to do this, and we call this a spike or a tooth. Sometimes people call this. And this has one dot on top. Now, if you have looked at Arabic writing, you know there are a lot of dots on top and bottom. Now, dots are very important. They're an essential part of the letter. This is not like some languages that have accent marks, for example, or an umlaut in German, which is added to a letter. This is not an accent on there. This is actually part of the letter. If this were two dots, this would become a different letter. So that's something to remember. So we have this one dot on top. This is my Nuun. This is the N sound. As I say, it's going to connect. Right now, we only have one letter to connect it to that we know. So let's connect this Nuun to an Aleph. Okay? See how it connects right in. And of course, nothing follows it because Aleph does not connect. So let's see if you can guess the pronunciation of this. Okay, consonant N followed by an A, na, na. This is not a word by itself, but this is how we'd make this sound. Okay, now what if I have another Nuun coming after that? Well, notice nothing can connect to this Aleph, so I make another spike, another dot, and let's say I put another Aleph there. Na, 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 na. Okay, that's what I would have. Okay, and you can see the division between the letters is right here. Now, the good thing about the dots is they're always going to be consistent in terms of how many there are and where they go. So, Nuun, the N sound, is one dot on top, wherever this letter appears in a word. So I said this is Nuun at the beginning of a word. Well, how would I have two of them together, okay? Giving me one in the middle. So this is not a common scenario, but okay, here's my Nuun at the beginning of a word, no problem. Suppose the next letter is Nuun. Well, I would do the same thing, except I'm going to have this connecting into it, so another spike, and I keep going. And you could just keep going on like this all day, but notice I have one Nuun, one N here, one N here. And this will be the same no matter what letter comes before it. So you see the shape doesn't change much. Now, what happens if we get to the end of a word? So I'm going to connect a third Nuun on here and pretend that this is a word that has three Nuuns in a row, which of course doesn't exist. So it's going to be slightly different. We don't want to end with this thing just hanging here. And so this is very typical of letters that have the spike in them, that have the tooth. And there are quite a lot of these in Arabic. What happens is if it comes to the end of a word, we add a second one onto it. And it becomes really a very nice shape. Nuun does this. Notice I have my first spike here, but this one's going lower, and it's making like a nice bowl shape or sort of a crescent moon. But notice we still have that one dot on top. So one spike, two spikes. This is going to be very typical. We're going to see a lot of letters that have this, so get used to it. But this is just a slightly different shape than what we have here. So you have this extra spike. Well, let's see if we can recognize this when it appears in some words. Okay, here we have 3 words, and they all have a noon in them somewhere. So let's take a moment to look at these and see if we can identify where the noon, where the N sound is. Now I realize most of these letters you have not seen before. That's okay. The point is to focus in on what you do know. So take a moment, let's look at this word. Do we see a noon in it? Hopefully we do. It's this middle letter. Now it's not this one. Notice this has a spike. It has a spike just like an N would, but the dot is on the bottom. Those dots do not move. Okay, so a dot on the bottom is a different letter, and it's actually a letter you're going to learn in the next lesson. Okay, we have this thing. This looks like a spike, but no dot. Okay, so this word actually has an noon, an N sound in the middle of it, bend. How about this one? Number of spikes, number of dots. The noon is where? Exactly, it's at the beginning. Why? We have our spike, looks similar to all the other spikes, but the one dot is on the top. This one, no, the dot's on the bottom, and hopefully you recognize that's this letter here. This one we do know. We just did that one a few minutes ago. That's our aleph. Now, how about this? Well, we have that 2 spike shape, but what's the problem? 2 dots. So remember, the number of dots and the position of them, that is always going to be firm on every letter because, as you can see, changing the number of dots changes the letter. Okay? Pretty good. All right, how about our last word? Where do we see the noon? Okay, hopefully you see it at the end. And notice it's that different shape. Because it's coming at the end of the word, instead of taking just one spike, we sort of start out the same, but we get that bowl shape, that curve shape. But still our one dot consistently always on the top. And these are all examples of the noon shape. Okay? And so this is something to get used to. At first, it can be difficult to remember, okay, why does this letter have 1 dot, this letter has 2, and so it can be a bit tricky at first. But remember, these same letters, we only have 28 letters, and we're going to use them for every word we make. So if you study Arabic for a year, for 20 years, you're going to see these same letters over and over again, and it's the practice, the repetition, that's really going to help strengthen it. So don't feel bad if you kind of forget a little bit at the beginning. Practice is going to strengthen. I want to point out one last thing. We talked about connecting and non-connecting letters. You see our 2 examples of non-connecting letters, the aleph. Now notice the difference here. Notice this gap in both cases. It's much smaller than the gap between words. And this is kind of how you know the difference, because you might ask, well, if I don't connect the letters, how do I know that this is not the end of a word? Well, see the difference? There's a gap, but it is nowhere near as big as the space I would put in between 2 words. And if you're using word processor, it'll do the same thing. It'll make a small gap between letters and a larger gap between words. So it's actually easy to recognize. So hopefully, even though you haven't seen most of these letters, hopefully when you look at it, you can now start to see the ones you do know jumping out at you. So we've covered a lot. We've covered connecting, non-connecting letters, consonants, vowels. You have quite a bit. So we have some exercises for you to practice. And this is a great start. We will see you in our next lesson. Shukran jazilan.